I just want to start by seconding what Martin Howe said before about the importance of this conference and trying to define the alternatives to EU membership. I think one of the great letdowns of the Scottish referendum was the fact that the two alternatives weren't clear. Alex Salmond failed to make his case for how an independent Scotland would look, but also it must be said that for the Better Together campaign, that was very unclear what they wanted as well, and the last-minute intervention of the VOW, I think, in the final weeks of the campaign was instrumental in that. So I think it'd be great if, when it comes to the EU referendum, people can actually make an informed choice between two more well-defined outcomes. Just secondly, to say the importance of the role of business in this debate. And again, you can look at the Scottish referendum for that. I think when people are considering what's good for a country's economy and what's good for jobs and for growth and for trade, they tend to look to business people often to give them the answers to those questions. Now, often they look to the more established business campaigns like the CBI to give them the answers to those questions. I think it's important that a range of business voices are heard in this debate, and that's why Business for Britain, we've been bringing together business people who are very clear in saying they want to see a change in Britain's relationship with the EU, or they would like to alternatively leave an unreformed EU. And these are summarised in two documents which should be in the foyer when you'll leave. The first one is called Change or Go, which outlines some of the challenges facing the European Union, some of the things that need to be addressed when it comes to the renegotiation. And the second one is called The Change We Need, which outlines 10 reforms that we would like to see when it comes to the renegotiation to make the EU much more competitive and much more pro-trade. And I must say, I'm actually increasingly optimistic that that change could actually happen. And last year, it must be said that it sometimes felt like Britain was trying to simply get its own deal when it came to the renegotiation. But now we face the re-emergence of the Eurozone crisis and all the news at the moment about what's going on in Greece. It's becoming increasingly clear that the Eurozone needs a very different structure to give it a possible chance of working. So more fiscal centralisation, more centralisation of economic powers to the Brussels level. And I think that actually gives the opportunity to create some form of two-tier Europe where countries like the UK who don't want anything to do with the euro can actually have more trading relationships. So I'm actually quite optimistic that we could actually get that change if other EU member states recognise that it's change that we want. Now, where is business in this debate about the alternatives? Now, I think when it comes to where business opinion is, when even the FT is saying that business struggles to speak with one voice on the EU, I think it's safe to say that business is increasingly split on this issue, and that's unsurprising because, of course, there are many sorts of businesses in the UK. And of course, you have the difference between the exporters versus businesses who are purely focused on the domestic market. And the ones who are focused on the domestic market, of course, that's 95% of companies in the UK, they still, of course, face 100% of the regulations that come from the EU. So you can understand why those business people who are focused on the domestic market are very concerned about the level of red tape that's come from the EU. I think other splits as well. You have the split between larger companies who tend to be more pro-European versus the SMEs, who of course are the backbone of the British economy. It's worth pointing out that of the jobs created since the financial crisis, 80% of those new jobs have been created in the SME sector. So they are massively important to the UK economy, and their needs need to be addressed when it comes to thinking about the EU. Then, of course, you've got the split between the corporate businesses, the PLCs and what have you, versus the private businesses and the more entrepreneur-led ones. I think often with the corporates, they tend to be focused on the next quarter's results and what their shareholders will be thinking in the very short term. So obviously they are often quite concerned and quite risk averse when it comes to making any big changes. But then you have the private companies and the ones which are entrepreneur-led, who actually can take a more medium to long-term view. And actually what they want is for Britain to be best placed going forward for the longer term. So they're extremely concerned with what's going on in the EU, and they accept that if there's a major change, there could be some turbulence in the short term, but they could see the huge benefits that would come from being outside of an increasingly protectionist, highly regulated EU. So they want to see those sort of changes happening. Another quick point on how you can actually measure business opinion, because sometimes I feel it's misrepresented in the press. There was an article in the FT the other week which said, "Exit will be a disaster for the UK and Europe, says city grandees." And from reading that headline, you might think that the entire city was actually against any change in our relationship with the EU. But if you actually dig down in the article, that was basically a survey done by the FT of 50 people within the city. And it wasn't just the city, it was people who were also tech entrepreneurs and policymakers and that sort of thing. So it wasn't really a representative sample of actually what people in the city think. And that's why at Business of Britain we've been very interested in looking at polling of the business community, recognising the fact you can't just survey a business group and work out what business thinks. You've got to do proper surveys. So I urge you to take a look at a publication which we did about 18 months ago now, where we commissioned YouGov to actually do a survey of the British business community. And we asked them to actually look at, do a correct split of small companies versus bigger companies, a correct split of all the different sectors when it came to the UK economy. So we had a properly representative sample of where UK business opinion was. And what we found when we did this survey was quite surprising, quite contrary to some of the other surveys that have happened. We found that basically by a majority of 46% to 37%, that business people thought that the costs of being in the single market now outweighed the benefits, which is quite a startling survey for many people. And also we found, very reassuringly, that 66% of business people want to have an EU referendum, actually see it as being the best means to actually get the change that we need within the EU. And it should be pointed out that both of those figures were also reflected amongst the big business people who we surveyed as well. So I think sometimes when you hear from some of the business group representing larger businesses that they're against a referendum or against any change, I would argue they're not actually representing the business leaders who they claim to represent. Now, what do business people want? Like I say, have a look at some of the things we talk about in our publication, which was done on the basis of surveys and also surveys of our members, and also looking at the business organisations and doing polling of the business community. And I think it's fair to say that when it comes to the different options, proper polling hasn't been done yet about what business people think about the Swiss option versus the Norwegian option versus the WTO option. I think when it comes to the Norwegian option, the EEA option, I think that it might be initially attractive for some business people, but then again for voters who are increasingly concerned about migration in the EU, they'd be very concerned that it allows free movement of people to continue. When it comes to the Swiss option, I think there could be some concerns about the complexity of negotiating so many bilateral agreements. That would be a concern for people. But overall, I think if there's one takeaway from my remarks today, it would be that business people recognise that the status quo within the EU is no longer an option. The EU is changing very radically and against our interests. And if you look at the city, for example, many people are increasingly concerned that with the Eurozone increasingly caucusing when it comes to votes and bringing regulations which go against the interests of the city and UK financial services, they're increasingly worried that will continue as we go forward. So actually people recognise that the status quo isn't there anymore. So really we're choosing between being increasingly isolated within the EU without the protections because we're outside the Eurozone, versus, yes, there could be risks if we make a change, but some of those risks could be worthwhile. And just one final thought, if I've got time, Tim. I think this debate is changing extremely quickly, and I think it's great we're having this conference today to talk about the alternatives. I remember the article that you published, Tim, when you were comment editor at the Times from Nigel Lawson, which I think was about 2 years ago now, when Nigel Lawson came out and said that he would personally vote out when it came to a referendum, and he felt that Britain leaving the EU, an unreformed EU, held no fear, and we would be able to get a good deal from the outside. And that changed the course of the debate in quite a significant way. And since that point, we've had other people like Boris Johnson saying that Britain would be better off out of an unreformed EU. So this debate is changing extremely quickly, and that change is reflected in the business community as well. Thank you.